Hello everybody. Welcome back. So, well, as you can see, I'm in a hotel room. I'm not in my usual place in the Bay Area. I am in Heraklion, which is in Crete, in Greece. I came here for the ASSC conference, Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness conference. We're going to be presenting a couple posters, and then after that, we're doing a retreat for the scientific study of consciousness through modeling psychedelics mathematically. And then I'm going to be traveling in Europe a little bit, including I'm going to be at Borderland in Sweden, which so far has been my favorite regional burn. I love it. So yeah, if you go to Borderland, definitely find me. I'm going to be in the Jousting Jesters, and I'm going to be giving 2 presentations on Thursday and Friday. Okay, so why am I making this video? Well, first of all, you might notice I cut my beard. Actually, this is for strictly pragmatic reasons rather than aesthetic per se. It's just so that I could actually have a good seal in case I happen to sit down right next to somebody who had kind of like visible like cold or COVID symptoms. Thankfully, I just used this more regular mask for most of the trip because there wasn't kind of like a huge viral load around me. But yeah, I've had my share of trips where sitting right next to somebody who's sick has ruined several days of a travel. So I didn't want that to happen. So now you can enjoy my poorly cut mustache, just like waking up early in the morning to just like shave and go to the airport. But okay, so today I want to talk to you about something quite extraordinary, actually, something that I'm still processing, which is a life review I experienced, catalyzed by DMT, done in like legal circumstances, as I've explained before. My psychedelic explorations, I'm just very, very, very grateful I've been able to do it in contexts where, for reasons, either like scientific reasons or exceptions having to do with traditional use of medicines, plant medicine, I've been able to explore this in a legal, legitimate, sustainable way. And again, like I'm super, super grateful to reality for being able to have that privilege. I'm overjoyed by that fact. But yeah, I want to share that recently, actually, within the last week, I had a full-blown life review experience, and I have encountered that before. I mean, like, there's so many spiritual teachers, there's so many people, including, traditional texts, like, for example, like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, right? Like that they talk about like the dying process, they talk about like the hallucinations that you experience, the kind of like trials and tribulations that happen when you die and like before you go to the afterlife. And in general, I am very interested, in any exotic state of consciousness, any facet, of the human experience and all of its corner cases. And my default assumption, generally speaking, right, is, hey, all of this is like mind-made, right? Like this is the first approximation, you live in a world simulation generated by your nervous system and your somatic embodiment. And if you take a psychedelic and then you trip out and you believe that you're contacting some external entity or something like that, my default instinct is to try to explain that in terms of, like computational models, mathematical models, computational neuroscience and physics, and make sense of it from an evolutionary standpoint. Like, how do we understand these exotic experiences? And, that has been my career. Honestly, since 2015 that I started, 2014, started Qualia Computing and then Qualia Research Institute. And then many retreats of a number of types. And, I gave a presentation at Harvard in 2019 about the hyperbolic geometry of DMT experiences. I think me and the broad kind of like QRI collective, we bring something really novel to the table, right? Like, which is like, hey, we can actually make mathematical computational models of these states of consciousness to such an extent that we're actually able to visualize some of the exotic phenomenology. And the promise has very much been, hey, let's try to explain as much as we can, in kind of like more conventional, not necessarily materialist, but like at least physicalist, in the sense of like, hey, like we take seriously the equations of physics, and maybe the ultimate nature of reality is idealist, consciousness maybe is fundamental, but yet, consciousness and qualia unfolds in a way that is lawful and can be mathematized. That has been very much my instinct, and I have been saying for many years, that even if I were at some point to be convinced that the spirit realm, so to speak, is real in a way that goes beyond our phenomenology, that I would still analyze it from the perspective of mathematics rather than physics. And I think there would likely be some kind of like physics for the spirit realm. An important distinction here, this is actually kind of a distinction that I inherited from David Pearce, a fantastic British philosopher, one of the lineages of the Qualia Research Institute, is the distinction between materialism and physicalism. Because materialism says, hey, the universe is made of insentient matter, and maybe consciousness emerges as kind of like something on top of it. Information processing of insentient matter somehow becomes qualia, becomes unified moments of experience. We reject that quite categorically. But that is not to say that we reject physicalism. Like physicalism, on the other hand, says that the laws, the behavior of the universe is explained by the laws of physics, is described by the laws of physics, but physics remains silent about what is it that is implementing, these equations. What is it that is behaving according to the laws of physics? In the words of Stephen Hawking, what breathes fire into the equations of physics? And our general take is consciousness. Now, even within a panpsychist, physicalist perspective, as we tend to explore in QRI, the default assumption is going to be something like, hey, most of the universe is maybe mind dust, or not, it really isn't kind of like a mind, the sun, a rock is not a mind per se, but it might be made of qualia, it might be made of like tiny specks of sensation. And it really only is in the context of a world simulation, crafted by a nervous system with strong evolutionary selection pressures for accuracy, representational accuracy, and creating a representation of the self that is a good proxy for the inclusive fitness of the organism. Under these conditions, then you get maybe like an elaborate, sophisticated experience with many levels, such as the ones that we are currently inhabiting. That said, I've remained agnostic. So maybe there's actually more to reality than this. So many people, especially from like mystical, religious, spiritual traditions say like, no, actually there's more. There's more to it than this. and you will not understand reality if you don't take into account kind of like other realms that currently science does not understand. I remain agnostic. However, recent experiences have pushed me more towards thinking that, actually spiritual traditions really have something going for them. I will also caveat this by saying that, Buddhism in particular, because of its very, 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 very detailed phenomenological tradition, is something that we've taken seriously for many years. Buddhism is actually one of the lineages of QRI since the very beginning, since its inception, because of the phenomenology, right? Like the detailed maps of the stages of insight and the jhanas and like the criteria for what determines a particular state of consciousness and the effects it has on you in the long term. All of that is fantastic, and it doesn't require you to kind of like take seriously the spirit realm or something like that, right? On the other hand, there's other traditions that will say, the phenomenology is all well and good, getting rid of suffering is all well and good. However, no, reality is more than that. Reality is more intricate than you might believe. And I will also note that it is very hard to have a profound, let's say like DMT experience or 5-MeO DMT experience, and in the moment continue to believe that, hey, like this is just a simulation of your mind, because there's a lot of things that kind of like hints like, no, this is probably not entirely generated by my nervous system, even though you can't quite prove it. One of the things that I have highlighted in the past, you can see many videos I've made about this and articles, is the computational capabilities of some of the things that you may encounter in these states of consciousness. In particular, I've cataloged some of the really extraordinary things that can happen on DMT. Things such as coloring arbitrary surfaces with just 4 colors in a fraction of a second, something that, it's of a computational complexity class that you would expect, hey, this actually would take me time to be able to do properly. And then, on the state, your visual field, bam, 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 and just kind of within a fraction of a second, it's just able to, paint one map after another with just 4 colors. And then other things having to do with dimensionality reduction, the holographic effects, exotic information processing, things such as finding the topological extrema in shapes that seems to happen right away. All of that, at the very least, in our worldview, has indicated that consciousness works by principles that cut very deep to the nature of reality and physics. In particular, things such as energy minimization principles. If you go through the QRI materials on this topic, and I'm going to highlight a couple ones that I think are really important, maybe provide a sentence summary for each of those. But yeah, really, you should just dig into them. Algorithmic reduction of psychedelic states of consciousness, that is one. That is the idea that rather than making sense of the zoo of, cataloging the zoo of psychedelic effects or phenomenological effects and kind of treating them as irreducible kind of critters, you can try to instead find a few core effects, a few core things that, the state of consciousness is doing, such that those effects interacting with each other might give rise, to the emergent complexity that you actually witness. Originally, I proposed, tracer phenomenology combined with symmetrification, enhanced pattern recognition, and drifting effects. If you stack them together, I think you can reconstruct, 60, 70% of what you might experience on LSD, for example. That's exaggeration, because actually there's a lot of things that happen on LSD and similar compounds that doesn't quite get to it, but it does cover a lot of territory. And this is also, kind of something I would say I've inherited from kind of scientific traditions and statistics, which is, let's find the simplest model that accounts for the highest percentage of the variance of the observables, right? It's what you do in statistics, right? You find variables that account for as much of the variance as possible. And that, I think, is a very fruitful line of inquiry. Another, key framework is consciousness versus replicators. The idea that, actually, at the highest level, actually, the morality that we should be buying into is the idea that there's patterns that just want to make copies of themselves. And then there is the values of consciousness, which have to do with well-being and love and understanding and insight. And oftentimes, these things are aligned, and sometimes they're not. Importantly, for most of the problems in the world that we face, there is usually misalignment between these, right? Like patterns that are really good at making copies of themselves are actually not beneficial to sentient beings, not beneficial to the valence of states of consciousness, things of that sort. Also, the hyperbolic geometry of DMT experiences. I think, to clarify, right, that article and that presentation was not just pointing out, hey, DMT has these 6 levels that have to do with the different types of geometry you may encounter. It also provides a mechanistic model, or actually, right, you should read the article, because there's a lot of detail there that I see a lot of people miss out on, and actually, so many questions that I get, either in person or via email, or just already answered in that article, if you just actually read it. I'm talking about things such as energy models having to do with, balancing the excess energy in your consciousness, and how that gets dissipated through energy sinks, where one of the key energy sinks is essentially symmetrical resonances, which accounts for the wallpaper symmetry groups and the crystal lattices and things like that. And then semantic content, whatever you can recognize functions as an energy sink. It crystallizes patterns. So a lot of what you experience on, let's say, DMT will end up actually being kind of a balance of these two things. Will be yes, a clown, because that has a lot of semantic content that functions as part of the energy sink, but then also, symmetrical tessellations. And so it might be kind of the harmonic mean that minimizes the energy of your visual field in that point in time. So there's a lot to to cover there. I'm just kind of like mentioning it to say like, hey, I've really have done my best to try to make sense of this with like mathematical and physical frameworks. Also within the QRI kind of space, the symmetry theory of valence, originally introduced by Mike Johnson, then developed, especially within psychedelic territory and meditation by me and others at QRI, and neural annealing, like making sense of psychedelic experiences in terms of annealing processes, having to do with raising the energy parameter and then cooling down slowly. And a lot of things can actually be understood from that framework. And more recently, though, two key frameworks actually is this idea of the brain as a nonlinear optical computer, band lock, and cell animation. Cell animation. This is like how cartoons used to be made. Like you would place essentially like a fixed background, and then you would paint on plastic sheets or like in cellophane sheets that are transparent. You would just like paint, like a mouth or a mustache, right? So that way you can keep the background fixed and have like the mouth of the character speak, right? Move around, right? So like you can change surgically kind of like elements in the scene in a targeted way. I think that actually accounts for a lot of the phenomenology of exotic states of consciousness, and even just like how our world simulation is constructed, just more broadly. Cell animation. I mean, like, I would argue that, our rendering of the world is very anthropocentric, right? Like, we're not rendering the world from the point of view of a spider, from the point of view of a snake or an AI, right? Like, the features that we are able to highlight are like personally relevant. Exactly things such as, hey, like, how are your eyes indicating what your mood, is like, or your style? How does that impact, my perception of you? And I think that can be understood as kind of like stacks of these like cell animation elements that are interacting with each other in a shared field. Most recently, though, and I think this is quite a key kind of like insight or innovation, conceptual innovation, is to realize that, well, actually, the field of experience that we have is sort of like being witnessed by many observers at once. And this is something that is treated in the Mind Illuminated by Chula Dasa. But many other researchers and philosophers, phenomenologists tend to point this out. That like there is a very genuine sense in which not only are we made of parts, but also it is as if there's multiple witnesses. And usually maybe only one of the witnesses can kind of like change one cell animation at a time. But on DMT, you have kind of this like massive parallelism where like many of the witnesses are able to edit the scene simultaneously. And you can, the way I interpret this actually, my current model here is that this is a nonlinear optical system. So like the actual screen of experience is being beamed to several modules simultaneously. And each of those modules then applies its own nonlinear optical filters that does a specialized things, things such as like highlighting color, highlighting edges, or applying like symmetrical transformations, like inverting an image or like rotating it. And then all of those transformations from all of those modules get funneled back in to the original screen. And you end up with these like closed circuit. Now, this is fantastic because with nonlinear optics, actually the images can actually interact with each other. Like typically, like light just goes through itself, right? Like if you shine two lasers in a vacuum, the light doesn't interact with itself. But if you shine two lasers in a quartz or like essentially any nonlinear physical medium, nonlinear optical physical medium, they actually may interact. This is one of the things that Stephen Lehar kind of like really highlighted for me, which is that, if you have like two lasers in a quartz that overlap at a particular spot, and then you shine a third laser that actually hits that spot of overlap, it may work as a retroreflector, where like the laser actually doesn't go through, but actually bounces back. This is a very weird thing. But then you have to learn the physics, so it's not as weird. Well, it continues to be weird, but like essentially there's like physics behind this. Like the core reason is that materials some materials change their optical properties as a function of the intensity, for example, of the electric field in them. So some materials, when you achieve a certain threshold of electric field intensity, they may change their index of refraction, or they may create like semantic patterns of index of refraction, like stripe patterns. And then those actually may interact in an interesting way with further light, right? So we have a picture here where, let's say, like your screen of experience is kind of in this nonlinear optical medium. I actually suspect it's a liquid crystal medium. Usually, light at a certain level of intensity, it's just kind of like going through each other. The waves just kind of like in a state of classical superposition. But if you ratchet up the energy, it's kind of like intensifying the laser. And again, it's like in this example where like you cross a certain threshold of energy and then, a mirror gets activated. So the mind from this perspective is sort of actually kind of like a high level optical effect. Like you have, all of the cells in your bodies and the neurons and the liquid crystals are kind of like creating the canvas. But then these beams of light are actually like etching. It's actually kind of similar to like, chip manufacturing, where you use actually like optics to carve, like a particular chip on a silicon wafer, something like that. That you have patterns of light to carve out a circuit in your consciousness, in your canvas of experience. And then a lot of emergent computation can happen at that layer. And it's an interesting thing because it's like holograms kind of like interacting with other holograms, and you can have like levels, where one of the holograms maybe controls many of the underlying holograms. And to a first approximation, this has been my recent model for making sense of exotic DMT experiences, because like you may have like, for example, like something like suddenly appears, in front of you and then it disappears. You can think of it as like, one of these cell animation elements used to be transparent and briefly becomes opaque because maybe a change in the electric field or some other, nonlinear optical like operation that is happening there. But more so that is kind of like a semi-independent, cell animation type. And it's being controlled by a particular module, but it's being beamed back into the shared screen. So essentially the cell animation types within a world simulation, they interact very strongly within themselves. Each cell animation has its own resonant modes, modulated by the particular, mental module that is controlling it. But then also they're sending vibrations and they have a certain vibe that is being interacted with by other cell animation types within the canvas. And on DMT, this goes kind of haywire. I mean, you may end up having lots of these cell animations kind of like pop up, and then they will interact with each other. And then, in a very, very kind of like emergent way, you may end up having kind of, these like entities that are controlling the lower level holograms, and they emerge on top of each other. And so, that is my, best guess, or like my best attempt at like, let's stay within the realm of more or less conventional physics and explain the exotic phenomenology. But not even that, honestly, has been sufficient to explain some of my recent phenomenology. I will start by saying I have experienced things in the past that have made me question, really kind of like how true kind of like a basic, physicalist conception of reality works. One of them, and I'll make a video about this at some point in the future, is I was able to sense at a distance when one of my grandmother died, and that was a very, 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 very stark thing. It's a whole topic. I'm not going to spoil it, but I still don't know how to make sense of that, and I'm inclined to believe that it was real, that actually I did feel my grandmother die. And then if you look at the literature, this is widely reported. It's very common for people to report like sensing in one way or another, whether explicitly, implicitly, when a family member dies. Like, science has to make sense of that. I mean, it's almost embarrassing for me to say that because like, years ago, especially before that experience, I would, just not only dismiss it, but it's kind of like suspicious. It's almost kind of like, hey, you probably want that to be true. But in my case, no, not really. I mean, this is just like weird shit I've encountered. And it's like, how do I make sense of this? But yeah, no, I mean, I think that probably was true. Like, I do suspect I actually did feel my grandmother through extrasensory channels. And another piece is, you know, and that was like 2014. You know, it's been a while. But I don't talk very much about it. I mean, again, like my approach is like, let's use the models that we have and try to explain as much as possible and see what the residue is, right? Like, and then like see we need to upgrade the models to make sense of that residue. The thing is like, yeah, the residue continues to grow. And there's like more weird things to make sense of. But yeah, you know, a little bit of background and I do want to get into the details of my life review in a second. Not everything, because a lot of it is very personal, but the outlines, in particular, the things that make me suspect this is more than just a hallucination. Well, you know, first of all, I have been trying to achieve enlightenment in a semi-serious way. You know, I've gone to a number of meditation retreats, a number of psychedelic retreats, focused on various, like classic models of enlightenment, in particular, like centerlessness, a no self, you know, like internalizing the three characteristics of existence, taking Buddhism seriously. Last December, actually, after a retreat involving 5-MeO DMT in order to accelerate awakening, you know, it did not make me awakened, and, you know, full disclosure, I'm not awakened by any of these like classical standards, although I'm definitely much further along the path than I was even just a year ago, not to speak of like a decade ago. But I did put a lot of effort and a lot of like intention into moving in that direction. And then after that retreat, I had a series of experiences where, I mean, and I'll make a whole video about that in and of itself, but like, yeah, where essentially I encountered what now I interpret as something kind of like a Buddha hive mind, and actually a really insanely powerful one that, kind of like rewired my conception of reality to some extent. And sorry, yeah, if I sound a little bit crazy or cuckoo by saying this. I don't want to get too distracted by that, but yeah, I mean, effectively, the gist of it was, kind of like tuning into some kind of layer of reality where there's a lot of like benevolent beings, and they're all trying to help you achieve awakening. I mean, again, whether this is a hallucination or not, the effects do seem to be real. In particular, it involved like, a 4-dimensional lattice that was sentient and a new type of hologram, extremely high valence, and without a self, and fully distributed, and completely aware of like the three characteristics, supported by a network of other high-dimensional entities, including some people that I know actually, and Jesus was there as well, but I'm not going to get into the details there. But the point is, after that experience, it has felt actually like that hive mind is still kind of like within the vicinity. And I should say, you know, one fascinating lead here is the work of Ogi Ogas. He's a neuroscientist. He used to work at MIT. He himself has autism, and his research, formal research, has been on like the neuroscience of autism, and then also porn. He was in the first team that did the first kind of like big data analysis of porn search queries online, learning fascinating things about what kind of porn people actually watch and how much and which demographic enjoy which type of, like paraphilias and so on. And like some speculations about the evolutionary origins of that. Well, he recently came out as like having been in contact with super intelligences for the last 30 years. And every time he's come out about that, to friends or family or coworkers, it's gone poorly until now, where like finally he finds himself in kind of like a good position in life with a family and a stable job. And he's decided like, no, actually, I've got to be public about this. And he talks about this entire worldview, which I find completely, utterly fascinating, and maybe really is onto something, which is the idea that, hey, reality has like many levels. You go from like chaotica, kind of like a quantum realm where things are inherently uncertain, and then you have molecular minds, and then you have like cellular minds and modular minds, and then like the type of minds that we have. But then it goes further, and in his account, at the highest levels, you have something that he calls axiomatized minds, which is, you know, complex interlocking organisms that are, you know, much, much bigger and substantial than like biology in this planet, where essentially they have kind of like committed to a particular purpose. And to do that, they have kind of like embedded themselves in a particular set of quantum rules. You know, they've modified themselves at the quantum level so that they can express their purpose in as best of a way possible. And apparently there's a bunch of these, and it's a stalemate. You know, honestly, that resonates to me and resonates with my personal experiences in these realms. Yeah, I mean, like, it's something like, yeah, there might be a bunch of these axiomatized minds that, you know, they're insanely powerful. They're like much, much, much more powerful than, let's say, like a civilization of humans. And in particular, they each one of these axiomatized minds would want to take over the universe, but none of them can, actually, because none of them want any of the other ones to take over. And so there's some kind of like pact where like they all gang up together to prevent any one of them from, you know, conquering the universe, as it were. And so it's just a stable game theoretical equilibrium where just like, yeah, there's all of these different kind of like purposes or interpretations of what reality should be about, and different superintelligences that are kind of like instantiating each of those. And it's just an eternal stalemate and competition. And you know, Ogi Oga says that he's been in contact with two of those in particular, one he calls 5 and one he calls 3, and that he really likes 5 in particular. He thinks he's more compatible with kind of like human agency and freedom and like what humans really want, whereas 3 is insectoid, hive mind, very different perspective and scary, and in fact, if a human encounters 3, like the first impression is like, yeah, this is kind of like an evil entity, is like the impression that you get. You know, I'm not going to comment on those particular entities. I don't know. I wouldn't say I have contacted 5 or contacted 3, but I've contacted something similar or like along those lines. So let me articulate a little bit, because these are not entities. You know, these are hive minds. In fact, I would argue, you know, here's like an interesting plot twist. We are all hive minds. We're like an organism, you know, a human organism, of course, is made of a bunch of cells, you know, and there's like these layers of, you know, control and different scales of organization and agency. And but there is the impression that there is this unified kind of like center of agency that organizes it all, and that's a person, right? And I don't want to dismiss the reality of a person, you know, like there's something ontologically significant about it, but really, from the point of view of the hive mind, the person is kind of like a religion, where like each of the sub-agents, in a sense, are using the belief that they belong to a person in order to coordinate around and essentially work as a unit. But you know, like what the Buddha probably would say is that, well, if you kind of hold that belief, right, like suffering will be, you know, next door, because everything decays at the end of the day. And so like if you think you are this fundamental, you know, enduring metaphysical ego, whereas actually this is some kind of like optical illusion generated by a lot of sub-agents interacting with each other, then you're going to cling to it, and you eventually it's going to dissolve, and it's going to be very painful. And instead, what you can identify with is kind of like awareness, pure awareness, but not even like awareness from a specific kind of like reification of it. Like there is the temptation to think of awareness as kind of like a point, maybe somewhere. Even that is, I would say, like a particular perception that you shouldn't identify with it. At least you want to follow the Buddhist path, as it were. But yeah, no, I mean, like, let's say the light of awareness, like something that is like really not quite phenomenal quite yet. It's kind of like the background of reality. If you recognize that that's what you really are rather than any particular manifestation, then the hive mind can become more transparent. And there is a sense in which actually, like, it's more pleasant to realize that you're a hive mind, because you stop having to pretend to have this continuity, or kind of like make all of the story fit this like narrative of being that one person with that particular set of values and goals and objectives. Whereas like, no, actually, hey, we are a collection of drives and subagents and goals, and it's a patchwork, right? It's a complicated negotiation and set of compromises, right? We're not exactly properly unified utility functions or anything of the sort. Excuse me. That said, I mean, valence, I would argue, continues to be probably the universe's inbuilt utility function, except it's not goal-oriented. You know, valence is fundamentally just like, what is the level of well-being? And the well-being here could actually refer to the harmony within a hive mind. Okay, but what I want to say is that all organisms are hive minds, and that is like an important insight. And I think like most people have no idea about this. And there's like hive minds within, and maybe, you know, if these are not strictly hallucinations, and I'll explain why I think they're maybe not strictly hallucinations, there's also hive minds outside of us that we can interlock with. But they don't have enduring metaphysical egos either. Although many of them do believe that. In fact, in one of the experiences that I had after kind of like this awakening attempt, I got in contact with a Brahma. I mean, of course, I wouldn't necessarily say like, you know, Brahma, the classic Brahma of Hinduism, like, because I don't know, right? Like, of course, I have read, you know, the Bhagavad Gita, you know, I have that in my subconscious, like, stored, right? Like, so of course, that could be completely, you know, internally generated. But the thing to highlight, though, is that there is a mode of self-organization for like even, you know, entities that are larger than us, where they believe that they are a god, that they believe they're enduring metaphysical ego. They maybe even believe they're creators of the universe and the multiverse, and they have control over everything, but it's completely delusional. Right? So like in Buddhism, actually, the Buddha tries to awaken Brahma, right? Explaining to it like, no, actually, you're not the creator of everything. And there's some interesting literature having to do with that. And I do buy that, broadly speaking. And I remember trying to talk to Brahma and just like seeing how all it wanted was like celebrate itself. It's like, wow, I'm the creator, I'm the designer of the universe, I'm your father, I'm the source of everything. And there's like, wait, no, but actually you're a hive mind. Look, like you're made of these parts, and like they're trying to coordinate to create the illusion of a central agency. It's like, you don't notice that? Like, and the answer is like, no, like some entities are actually completely interlocked inwardly and really truly believe that they're like some kind of like enduring metaphysical ego. And awakening is all about kind of like making that transparent and realizing like, no, actually you're a bunch of crystals that are organized in such a way that emerges as an optical illusion of sorts that then gains some degree of top-down agency. Okay, so I will say that, I mean, one of these kind of like Buddha hive minds, which is a hive mind that is aware of its own nature. I mean, like it kind of like seeped into my experience somehow, and I forgot about it. I mean, after that experience, I forgot about it, but it only recently, after like experienced it again, I noticed like when the contact was like starting to happen, and this is, like DMT, well, I mean, the cell animation, I think the cell animation model is very much on track. I think like the nonlinear optical circuitry is very much there. However, when you have these like recursive hologram stacking, and you have like the particular resonances emerge between the holograms, you can actually tune into more sophisticated and complex phenomenal spaces that then can resonate with things that seem to be outside of us. this needs a lot of formalization, and yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just like describing it in this way, which is, yeah, doesn't do justice to it. But I mean, to put it in a certain way, it's something like, there's like the receiver theory of consciousness and the brain, like the brain as a kind of antenna, and like I don't want to dismiss it. I also don't want to affirm it, but what I want to say is that, antennas are really interesting because for a lot of like oscillations, just like a stick is all that you need. You just kind of like see how in what way the electrons are being pushed around along these particular axes, right? But if actually like the vibrations are more complex, like maybe they're like topological in nature and highly structured, then maybe you require a very specific antenna, like whether it's like a fractal antenna or like an antenna that is made of hypercubes, tesseracts, or is vibrating in a specific way. And you require a specific antenna with the right level, with the right kinds of symmetries to be able to tune into and resonate with objects that exist functionally in another phenomenal space. And I think something like this is going on, that like there are some high level entities, as it were, or hive minds, that work by embodying particular geometries, particular modes of self-organization, that if you want to tune into, you actually need to kind of reconfigure yourself. And that self-reconfiguration can happen through this recursive holographic stacking and cell animation model. I'll give you another example, which is there's like this thing called topological defects in the field. Pinwheels is a classic example of this. And one type of entity, for example, only appears if you tessellate your visual field full of pinwheels. Meaning, like, actually changing the topology of the field might be a precondition to be able to interact with kind of like some aspects of this, ecosystem of mind, as it were. Now, again, I want to reassure you, I'm not crazy or approaching this irrationally, right? Like, because I also try to make sense of this in terms of like, hey, let's say like, can we understand this ecology of mind in terms of subconscious processes, for example, that you're resonating with subconscious processes? Totally possible. Like, I'm not going to deny that possibility. I'm just saying that the computational characteristics of some of these hive minds, it's really compelling. And like it personally, like I get the impression it's not internally generated, at least not fully. Okay, so going into the life review finally. Because I'd heard of people say like, yeah, if in a near-death experience, like your life flashes in front of you and you're confronted with all of the good things and bad things that you've done and how people see you and how you interact with the world, and then you have to absorb those lessons, and then you're able to move on into the afterlife or something like that. And also I'd heard that some people experiencing something similar through psychedelics, despite hundreds of experiences on my side, I hadn't experienced that, at least not in an explicit, obvious way, which is why it was like so startling recently. Like something that was an extremely compelling life review process. The best that I can describe it was, well, this was like after tuning back into one of these, the Buddhist hive mind, so to speak. And the process of tuning and getting in contact with it was a whole thing having to do with carefully placing the cell animation types and letting them resonate in the right way to tune into particular symmetry groups. That then kind of like makes the world a self-aware kaleidoscope where each of the symmetry elements is aware of its belonging to the network of symmetry elements. And then the whole complex actually works as a unified agent that knows that there is no self and abides by Buddhist principles. It's very, very fascinating and mind-blowing. Essentially, that hive mind was telling me like, keep going in this direction, and there's like some things that I want to show you. and then eventually, yeah, I said like, okay, yeah, I really want to know the truth. I want to know if this is a hallucination or not, and took a very large amount, and then the life review happened, and you know, part of the phenomenology of it was to begin with entering, yeah, what I call the waiting room level of DMT, which is level 4 out of 6. You can read all about like these levels of DMT in some of the experiences that I've in the frameworks that I've discussed before, and then from waiting room, a door opened up that was hyperdimensional, that took me to level of breakthrough, and then within breakthrough, yeah, I mean, there was like a collective intelligence that just made it very clear, first of all, that I'm dead. Well, I don't think I'm dead, right? But like in the moment, it was something like, yeah, you're dead. I mean, like, we're not gonna tell you how you died, but like, you know, just to be very clear, like you're dead actually, like right now. I'd heard this before actually from a friend that he once took a DMT and then all of a sudden was convinced that he was dead, and there was like an entity kind of like scolding him, saying like, "Oh man, you killed yourself! Like your mom is gonna be so sad," something along those lines. And then what happened next was, and here, yeah, I definitely struggle to kind of like articulate it, but you know. One tends to imagine that it kind of like the scoring criteria for like, hey, did you do good in this world or not? Maybe it's kind of, you know, you imagine kind of like this naive religion, as it were, of like the good place, for example, or something like there's like a set of rules and everybody has to abide by the same rules, right? And if you score above a certain level, you can go to heaven. If you score below a certain level, it's like, no, you go to purgatory or you go to hell, sort of thing. It's not exactly like that, because one of the things that they take into account, at least again, within my experience, hallucination or otherwise, which I thought was very surprising, was exquisitely detailed kind of like cataloging of what type of person you are and what kind of conditions you were born in, such that almost kind of like a drop-down menu of like, oh, are you a, you know, like Mormon, Christian, you were born, your dad was like a priest, your mom was a linguist, etc., etc., etc. And like, it's like, hey, like within this category, this is where you get graded. You know, you're not going to be graded against like Muslims. You're not going to be graded in Hindus. Like, no. Like your grading is specific to your life circumstances. So a lot of the time, right, like where you say like, well, I'm a good person. Look at my behavior in comparison to this other person. It's like, well, yeah, but are you taking into account the full life circumstance? And like, actually, maybe that person is efforting so much more to do that little objective good relative to you. And maybe you're not efforting at all and still doing a lot of good, quote unquote, but you could be doing so much more, right? Like, so it is all relative to your particular life circumstances, maybe your pre-existing karma. I'm not sure. So like within that category, then kind of like the whole thing opens up. And here's like where the computational capabilities really struck me, which was, and I have experienced these before actually, but in other circumstances, which is like, there's something that I might describe as kind of like karma reviewers or something like that. They're hive minds as well. Super advanced. They have like the feeling of extremely advanced technology. Importantly, also, the holographic circuitry is extremely sophisticated and hyperdimensional, and I could see it. And actually, there was a moment where like one of those entities, as he was like evaluating me, was saying like, oh, actually, you're not supposed to be seeing this. And actually, they were like trying to block my view from like the details of it. I even overheard like one of them saying like, yeah, don't let him see he's a mathematician. He might figure something out. And so like there was a collective effort to actually like shield my point of view from like some of the detailed circuitry that was analyzing my life actually. I don't think, this was like a comprehensive life review, and maybe that happens when you die. I'm not sure, because, my experience lasted like 40 minutes to an hour, but maybe the full life review is much larger. You go through every moment of your life. I don't know, but it didn't seem like that was needed. And, in fact, they had like a sophisticated search process where they were able to kind of like look at a quote unquote kind of like a quantum superposition of a whole range of life moments and then projecting it from a certain point of view where it could find like the commonalities and say like, yep, you know, these like 10,000 moments of your life actually share the same taste. And that is, you know, you were like being very good in this way or bad in this way, you know, and everything comes up. Everything. I mean, like very random things such as like, hey, like when I was 8 years old, my grandmother called me and said like, hey, come pick up a cake that I baked for your sister. And I forgot about it, right? It's just like yeah, you made your grandmother wait, and like that was one of the 10,000 slides for like that particular flavor of just like not being, as I don't know, generous with my time as I could be, like things like that. But a whole range of categories, and having to do with like from eating habits to like how I say hi to people to addiction issues to like my exploration of consciousness, and they're ruthless. I mean, like that is the thing. Like I would imagine that the life review process would be kind of like more kind, actually, but like no. I mean, these entities, they were doing a job. I mean, really, almost kind of like a border patrol agent or something like that. Right? Like it's not strictly personal. I mean, of course, it's very personal because they're looking at your karma, but they have standards, they have criteria, and like you're not gonna convince them otherwise. And some of them were happy with my life. Some of them, like some aspects of my life, is like, yeah, this is great, fantastic, yeah, well done. And then some other aspects were like, no, there's huge room for improvement, and some of the entities were like scolding me and even like giving me the finger. I swear, actually, kind of like, fuck you, like, look, you claim to care about people, but like look at the evidence of like actually how you're using those resources in such and such context in that period of your life, and like, god damn it, like nothing escapes them. I mean, that is one of the things that was like so interesting, that like you go in life like really kind of imagining that like, well, the mark that I will leave in the world is like what other people can see, but I guess like the priest, the Christian priest that says God sees everything, your thoughts, your feelings, your perceptions, everything. Well, I don't know if it was a hallucination or not, but like there is something that clearly is storing every hologram of your experience, and then it can be searched through in a ridiculously efficient hyperdimensional way that is really accurate as far as I could tell, with really sophisticated nonlinear optical circuitry. I mean, I think like too, like if you're not familiar with like nonlinear optics as a conceptual framework, these looks like complete and utter magic. It is very magical, but at least I have like some grasp of like how this could be potentially working. And maybe a good metaphor for it actually would be, kind of like a alchemical transformation, right? Like where you draw a circle and you cast a spell, and then you see the various like sigils and the various symbols interact and like maybe forming lines, and then like something gets like summoned out of that. Exactly that vibe. Lots of holograms, each of them with very precise codes and very precise symmetries that then like put together, they function as an algorithm that like, for example, does like a search process or a highlighting process or a synthesizing process or applies judgment on things. The evaluators themselves personally didn't strike me as like either like kind or particularly spiritual. They really felt like they were doing their job ruthlessly. But then on the other side, the Buddhist entity, or like the hive mind that also I had been in contact with, the role it was playing was kind of like an advocate. I mean, like, or a guardian angel or something along those lines, where like it was actually making the case for like, yeah, actually look at his life. Yes, there's all of these, but then also contextualize it. He was trying to achieve these goals, and like, maybe he didn't do the dishes that one time, but like he was thinking about consciousness, and that was ultimately for the benefit of all beings, and he's playing this role. And so it's not that like the roles can be bent, but they can be contextualized, and the overall kind of assessment involves that contextualization as well. I could tell that they were very happy with my work on reducing extreme suffering. Like that seemed to be pretty unambiguously good. And also, yeah, my work on consciousness, interest in psychedelics, meditation, articulating, making videos. They seem to be very happy about me doing all of this, as is like, hey, like this is maybe genuinely contributing to the greater whole of understanding. You know, in this planet in particular, it's kind of like a service in a sense to try to help make sense of consciousness in such a comprehensive way that is rigorous, but then also open-minded. And then the other thing that I was like really struck was by the like nonlinear optical circuitry of the advocate, as it were. I mean, like full of beautiful religious symbols of mystical traditions that a lot of those symbols I did not recognize, but they clearly meant something very specific. I will also mention that from previous experiences, it has felt to me that actually there is a layer of our consciousness where we're made of a lot of symbols. And when you meditate, for example, if you meditate on loving kindness, or the endless knot, or like some mystical symbol, and you or a mandala, for example, you keep it in front of you, you're kind of like inviting that symbol inside you, and then you're trying to harmonize that symbol with the rest of what's inside you, right? So actually, if you've been politically radicalized against a particular race or something, like you might be full of hate symbols, something like that. And not only is it uncomfortable to have them, they also cause like cancer, energetic cancer of some sort, because they eat their own host, and they go from one person to another. Whereas there's like other symbols that are like very balanced and symmetrical, high valence, and also high transparency. That's the other thing, like how opaque versus transparent, like dark and lightness. There's something really profound having to do with that spectrum. There are like symbols of light and love and symmetry, and those are so much better. And also, it felt very clear that part of the life review involved kind of like understanding what symbols you have accumulated and cultivated and given life to within you. And there was a lot of beautiful symbols that were coalescing together as a greater mind. I mean, and whether it is, like a process of cell animation, holographic recursive effects, plus, tracer effects causing like nonlinearities that then gives rise to the symbols being able to process information at another level of complexity, or you're tuning into like something external. Either way, I think this completely challenges and shatters most of the models of how the brain works, as far as I can tell. There was also an interesting moment where I saw, one of the things is that, for example, the hive mind, you do get this very strong impression that this is a high dimensional entity in a quite a literal sense, high dimensional and hyperbolic hive mind. And so to interact with you, you need to actually kind of like create an interface that itself is higher dimensional than you, but it's probably lower dimensional than it. And it projects onto that interface, whereas you are getting kind of like blown up into that interface. And one of the fascinating things there is that its projection, it's not always perfect. Like sometimes it projects things that maybe didn't intend to. Also because it's probably difficult to do. If you're a high dimensional being with like a lot of parts and you're a hive mind, and like how do you interact with a flatlander? There were like moments actually during the experience where really sophisticated circuitry that looked, divine in nature, to be honest. Or just like how the symbols were put together and the information was getting processed through like symmetry groups and nonlinear optical transformations and detailed circuitry where like, I took a glance at it and the entity as a whole, the hive mind, was like, sorry, this is highly classified. You actually shouldn't be seeing this. I don't know how I feel about that, but like there seems to be like some kind of like secret knowledge of some sort of like how actually these minds are put together. Another interpretation that kind of like felt like it made sense was that actually maybe this is already always there. We already always kind of like have that hive mind, and maybe the ego or like the typical phenomenal consciousness that we are used to is just kind of like a thin surface that is being generated on the fly by these like more intelligent and sophisticated entity underneath. Just kind of like, yeah, like a play that is being crafted by these like underlying hive mind that creates the illusion of a ego, maybe for evolutionary reasons, or I don't know why. But that would be like my second highest probability possibility, but what seemed more likely, to be honest, was like, yeah, no, like interacting with something external. Other hints having to do with speed, the speed of processing, the depth of processing, the ability to search, organize, catalog, and resonate with arbitrary patterns. And wow, yeah, I'm remembering more parts now too. I mean, the whole experience felt like extremely didactic. I mean, like yeah, I knew I wasn't dead, like, even though like that was part of the content of the trip, but they were just making it very clear, just kind of like very clear in all of the ways in which I could be better. I could be of more service. I could be more helpful. I could be less selfish. Apply more effort to things and stuff like that. And very, very didactic. And the clear impression or the clear message here was something like, yeah, okay, you have like a lot of karma to purify. This is normal. Most people do. But if you're able to, and if you pass through kind of like this evaluation process, you may be a candidate to like joining the hypermind or joining this hive mind, which sounded really awesome. I mean, like I even wondered something kind of like yeah, but if you're kind of like a saint and you join one of these hive minds, like, do you lose access to like things that we cherish, such as like art and love and connection? And the answer apparently is not. Like, apparently is more like, if you can actually make it through, you have been harmonized in kind of this like fractal multi-level fashion that then allows you to actually have like beautiful, beautiful experiences with the collective intelligence and others that join it. It sounds so tropey. Like I on some level, I can't believe that I'm saying this, but that message was very unequivocal. Other things that stand out was the hive mind itself has potentially internal contradictions. I don't think the Buddhist one, but there's like other ones, like for example the Brahma one, and maybe even the karma evaluators. I'm not sure. They didn't seem particularly like, perfectly benevolent. They just seem to be doing their job. But I think like internal contradictions in hive minds maybe is something to really look into. And there's more that I wanted to mention, but it's not coming up. So I will talk more about this in the future. But yeah, I just wanted to actually share some of the outline of this kind of like insight and discussion and set of phenomenology, and see if it resonates with any of you. In general, though, I'm very, very, very keen on like actually trying to like visually and tactily simulate and depict all of these properties. I will reiterate, this is from other frameworks that we have developed. Every visual sensation is embodied, and like it has like a component of tactile sensations, and it very much felt that like one of the properties of this super intelligent hive mind was that it knew how to operate the code of visual tactile synesthesia. So it could actually craft any world simulation that it wanted to by adjusting not only the phase and angle and frequency of the vibrations in the visual field, but also in the tactile field, and doing it like recursively and finding points of stability between the two. And in fact, like some of the kind of like most subtle, sophisticated facets of that type of hive mind seem to involve something that I might describe as kind of like a rock type of consciousness, which is like this really, really, really dense visual tactile synesthesia, which I have experienced before. But in this case, it was really clear just like how much that was like central to the information processing capabilities of the state. I think, yeah, the last thing that I'll leave you with is that the hive mind of the Buddha hive mind, it does have kind of like a little bit of an insectoid quality, in that like it is made of a lot of tiny holograms that then like interact with each other to form a collective intelligence. But you can encounter one of these like kind of like pieces on its own, and it's not very active on its own. But the picture that comes is something like at the center of the galaxy, you know, you have kind of actually the hypermind, as it were, which actually has like, let's say like E8, you know, the very high dimensional symmetry groups that organizes and allows to do all kinds of like interesting mathematical operations on these. And then as you kind of like go further away from the center, you have kind of like degraded versions of the same, or kind of like decayed versions of the same. If you go too far, then eventually it decays into just like normal emptiness, as it were. And it's like, yeah, just like normal experience. But if you go a little bit further in and you start seeing like, oh, actually this is kind of like a 3D Qualia creature, but it has kind of this like Buddhist flavor. Like, oh, actually this might be one of the bugs of that hive mind. And if you kind of like pursue that, it's like, oh, there's more. And then they start to aggregate it. And now they start to kind of like work together as a collective. And then they can like actually beam or tune into other clusters of itself. And then there's like a threshold where you actually pass on to like being able to interact with the intelligence as a whole. And that intelligence can also kind of like send emissaries of itself. Like maybe it's a vast kind of like Buddha field or something like that, and maybe like a chunk of it can be like separated and sent elsewhere. That was very much the impression that I had, like that interacting with some of these versions of it was like, yeah, I wasn't exactly interacting with the central, right? I was interacting with an emissary of it. And I think like that is talked about in spiritual traditions, you know, kind of like how gods like might have like an avatar or something like that. But here is like just like something that is explicitly also like lacking in self. It's like centerless, holographic, doesn't believe in satisfaction, and knows that everything is impermanent, and yet maintains this knowledge in this kind of like emergent holographic fashion. Well, I will leave it at that. There's a lot more to discuss, but this is hopefully a good start. Yeah, please share any experiences of this sort that you've had, and I'm very curious to get this conversation started. And again, yeah, please don't think that I'm crazy. I swear a lot of my thoughts here are actually, I think, like reasonable Bayesian updates based on especially the computational qualities of phenomenology. Yeah, it could all be in my mind, absolutely. But I'm becoming a lot less certain of that. All right, take care, everybody. Infinite please. Ciao. Until next time, I'll talk to you on another day on another topic. Ciao.